And then what I thought I would do is just a conversation starter. And I'm sorry if I'm going to put anybody on the spot, but Dan's been driving me around the last couple of days, and I've been talking with trans students here and with grad students, and one of the things that I've actually been talking about is this idea about nostalgia, you know, and is there a trans nostalgia? And as I was writing, the pre-existing theme that was showing up in my talk was about breathing. Because I actually start with I won't give you the line that I start my paper with tomorrow, but it was about the relationship between breath and revolution, and it kind of weaves its way through a Frantz Fanon quote about combat breathing, and you know, that kind of became the metaphor that I was working on. And as I was trying to pivot the paper from the more, you know, sort of theoretical and descriptive part to trying to link these like theoretical ideas to embodied practices, so that I could return to the idea of breath at the end. I found myself writing last night and this morning this piece that kind of became like a nostalgia piece, maybe. I don't know, it was about reworking childhood memories and materials, and so I thought, well, maybe I'll just read a little bit about that, and then we could see if it becomes the beginning of a conversation. Is that wrong? Both my parents worked full-time jobs. The swimming pool at the YMCA became my babysitter each summer, all summer long. Dropped off in the morning, picked up in the late afternoon. By 13, when my father died, the water had become an important refuge, albeit one I could attain only after having passed through the locker room. That sex-segregated space of total nakedness was a psychologically brutal gauntlet for a young, pre-transitional, transgender identified person to pass through, and the public semi-nakedness of the swimming suit hardly any less excruciating. But I accepted both conditions as the price to be paid for gaining the space I craved. I reveled in the freedom of three-dimensional underwater movement, a freedom possible for precisely as long as I could hold my breath. I worked consciously, did breathing exercises to extend the duration of breath retention, to maximize the time spent in the spaces between. I could detach from and observe there my father's absence, my mother's distress, my own dysphoric relation to embodiment, the suffocating pervasiveness of social gendering, and take a fundamental pleasure in a greater capacity for movement, moving in a way impossible to move on the terrestrial plane. Play space, tumbling in dream time, philosophizing and world-building, refiguring as I moved. I could contemplatively experience the fact that the liquid environment that enabled such joy was simultaneously unlivable for any great length of time, while the gaseous environment I returned to sustain life in the physical dimension threatened social and psychical death for my own most precious sense of self, the very crisis that ultimately motivated my gender transition. As a child, I cultivated an amphibious disposition, moving ceaselessly between things that both killed me and enlivened me in different ways, at different rates and speeds. I meditate now on this amphibian nature, aquatically mammalian, off-center from the human, while lying in meditation, shavasana, the corpse pose. At work, I intellectualize the necessary discoveries of my childhood as a meta-methodological transgender art of living. Every breath that a trans person takes is an act of revolution, and breathing contains the space between. We need to breathe to live, and we need the space to dream in, detached from the struggles of the mind. All right, I mean, I can tell you a little bit about what I was consciously thinking. One, I was going like, God, I really only have one story to tell. This is sort of like the end of this article I wrote about Frankenstein 7 years ago, which has this swimming metaphor, and there's a breathing thing in it. It's like, oh, we always go back to the same place, don't we? The other thing that I was thinking of, particularly around the idea of play, was, I was thinking about, totally blocking out his name now, the psychoanalytic theorist, does the good enough mother, Katie Winnicott, right? So, thinking about Winnicott and the idea of a facilitative environment, that what he says, in his whole thing about the good enough mother is that, you don't want the perfect mother, do you want the neglectful mother, but you want the mother that's just good enough to like keep the baby alive and like give it a lot of space to play, like creating a facilitative environment that allows for, the developing subject to develop in a way that like it creates an open and secure relationship to the world. And that idea of a facilitative environment feels really important to me, it's like, because, your environment can be deadly, and it's like, think about the metaphor of the infant child, it's like, it can't live on its own. It's like, we need the technology of, human sociality to live, it can't live on its own. But it's like, you have to find that sweet spot between control and abandonment, right? That creates a sense of freedom and free play. And so for me, like finding that play space, having a sense of being in an environment where you can, you kind of have the freedom to mix and match and put things together. It's like for me, like that is the space that I always look for when I'm thinking about like how to do gendered embodiment, like not get killed for being trans on the one hand, not get trapped in, some kind of convention on the other, but to find that space where you actually get to experiment and put things together. Amphibios, it means like two lives, right? And so part of what I was consciously thinking about is having not having a place to live as a trans person, like not having a place to put your feet down, and that, you're constantly moving between things that are, alternately like lethal or deadly or not sustaining to you somehow, and moving in some place that gives you a certain kind of freedom or possibility or potential or capacity that's ultimately not sustainable. So like for me, it's like it's always about this vacillation. It's about one of the other ways I've written about this same idea for me is when I'm sort of writing in more of a, kind of a wonky Foucauldian biopolitical language is to talk about transgender as an emergent organization of life that's constantly flickering across the threshold of viability, getting pulled in a more necropolitical direction at times and getting pulled in other directions through which your life becomes capable of being invested in, but that, it's fraught, it's flickers across the threshold of viability. And I've actually been really inspired by some people I know who do trans film theory, who like took that image that was in my old Frankenstein piece about the mise en abîme of repeatedly breaking through the surface of the water and still being underwater, and shimmering, like moving towards a shimmering surface in doing that, thinking of the shimmer, the flicker as being like exactly where film comes from, that it's the alternation of the light and the dark that actually produces the image. And I do other work about like thinking about transsexual embodiment through cinematic terms, sort of really thinking about the repeated moving into darkness and then like coming into image. That there's a flickering between the virtual, and the actualized. That part of the transsexual practice is actually about materializing a grasped virtuality and making it real through how you embody it. And And so, that's what I was thinking about. I was thinking about moving between two kinds of life, two incommensurable kinds of life when I was thinking amphibian. Two life, both life, amphibios. But then the other part is thinking, okay, so how do I take that idea that recurs for me in my work and go like, oh, amphibian, let's call it amphibian. It's like we'll bring up animal studies stuff. That'll bring up the inhuman, the non-human, the post-human. It's about an imaginative becoming with in a kind of Harawaiian sense of like, it made me think of taking swimming classes when I was a little kid, and you graduate from tadpole to frog to minnow to shark. And you wind up dolphin. That was like, right? So, it's the aquatic mammal, and I was just like thinking, it's like, kind of getting into my dolphin headspace and thinking about mammalian evolution over the eons. And like, oh, these are land-based creatures that start to breathe, but they're fully in the water, but they have to keep surfacing, and that's really what it was like when I was imagining myself swimming, but I liked being underwater as much as possible and moving along the X, Y, and Z axis and just coming up to grab a little air and going back down, and that was such pleasure. I hadn't really thought about it until I was writing this, of like, oh yeah, it's like becoming with dolphin. So I just wanted to put that in, and I wanted to like leave some little trace in the words that would allow somebody some other time, if I publish this, to attach animal studies to trans studies right there. Kind of because of the unlivability of one kind of life, the imagining of another kind of life, which, is kind of the theme of what I'm going to talk about tomorrow. Like the relationship between history and futurity. It's like history, there's a responsibility, for like a lived or the world's been organized in particular ways, and it is violent for some of us, for a lot of us. And so, like, what do you do if your history, for me as a trans person, what do you do if, like, history, like, isn't actually the place that you go to have a model for living, or for what a just world looks like? Like, what do you do with that? It's like, that's, where you have that turn towards a futurity. So.
A new history, like a new future from a new history. Like, there's also, like, a new history you can build for yourself as well, right?
Right. And that history isn't just, objectives, like this thing happened and this thing happened and this thing happened. There's an imaginative relationship to your past. There's different things that can be recovered, different things that can be imagined, different questions you can ask of the past. So it's like, this is where, kind of where I go as a historian. I think in a disciplinary sense, what you get taught is, there are records, you can go read them, you look at the traces of material processes and archival records, and you use your your rational mind to like figure out what that story is, and then you tell that story to other people based on the evidence of, that you've seen. And for me, that's yeah, of course you can do that, but there are always like meta historical questions about like the very categories that we use for interpreting the past, and like there can be a more imaginative way of engaging with the consequences of your your inheritance of all kinds of ways that are just because they're fictive doesn't make them false. And since I could never get a job as a historian, I got to teach in gender and women's studies programs, which is like you can make up anything, right? Anything, right? I don't want to say that you can just do anything, but that it's I didn't have to hold myself to some kind of disciplinary. Historians can say that. I'm like, great, I'm not a historian. I'm undisciplined. I'm an undisciplined person trained in history, and I do find opportunity in both in my creative and film and theoretical work to like think the relationship to the past differently than I got to do in my historical training. So I think a lot about the relationship between how do we like engage with our past in the present in a way that like helps us imagine a future that we want to live in. Like history isn't the past, like history is an action that we take now, you know, and that it's the work of weaving in some ways. I mean, I think of it as it's like in the moment you're imagining the kind of world you want to live in, and how do you take the inertia of what's happened and find a way to like harness that vision to the inertia of, you know, the material history of the world.
What is the future goal? Like, if the goal is to be able to breathe more freely, or is the goal like to be able to breathe at all? Like, what can we do with actual recuperation? Like, because this is like really roundabout, I'm sorry, but like I think about like something that irks me about how we think transgender history is that like we tend to neoliberalize it and be like it's individual experiences, and then once a pattern emerges, we like hold everybody subject to that pattern. Like I'm thinking about like that article, The Persistence of Transgender Travel Narratives, and it's like, okay, so now we actually have a language to talk about like there are commonalities, but there's also like ways to disrupt those. So I'm wondering, what do we do with the commonalities that are simultaneously traumatic but also nostalgic?
Something, you know, maybe not quite Freudian, like the Doc Ford game, like you're always restaging something that, you know, until you like heal from that trauma. Not wanting to make it that simple, but like thinking about like each return, each nostalgic return to something, that if it's harnessed towards pleasure, if it's harnessed to, you know, connection with, you know, with living, you know, like there's something, if you're wanting to live, you know, it's like, and you're working through this stuff, and each iterative, nostalgic pass back to that thing, you carry a little bit more of it forward and assemble it with something more critical or something more pleasurable or something more life-affirming and not false and not rooted in violence or trauma. So that it's always that iterative revisiting, remembering, you know, that when I think in film terms, I think a lot about, you know, the cut, you know, you think cut violence, and yes, cut is a violence, but you're doing a violence to film, the film stock itself, but it's actually without the cut, you don't have the narrative. You know, just like it's a constitutive violence. It's a violence that enables a dismembering, that enables a remembering, that lets you put things together again in a different order, in a different way, with a different meaning. And it's really like a tangible sense. So thinking about cuts joining, you know, as well as cuts separating, you know, thinking about, so if we think about this, and I wasn't thinking about nostalgia before yesterday, so just a lot of nostalgia is coming out. Coming home to a place I've never been before. John Denver.